Alright, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the Wave Manager. And the Wave Manager is in charge of which wave we're in, as well as, well, it's in charge of spawning a wave and loading the wave definitions. Right now I'll talk about how it loads wave information. So if you look here, this is the load wave information method. Basically it's called only once in the level 1. As you can see here, it's only called once. It loads the wave information with the text file. And it basically gets those two columns, the current identifier and the value, and puts them in strings. And then it checks the identifier and puts it in the corresponding, checks to see if it's any of the corresponding variables. And then it'll input that value for that variable in a temporary wave definition, which is just a class that has all those variables of what a wave is. And at the very end, it'll push that wave into a vector. I did a vector because I wanted the indexing, and I also wanted to be able to push to the back, because the way my input is set up is that you can add as many waves as you want into the text file and it'll input it in. It also works so that if you miss a variable or you don't have one, it'll result to go into the default values, which are right here in the wave definition. So that's how it loads it. And there's two things that control the wave in terms of which one we're doing right now, is the startup and the load player wave. Or yeah, the load player wave. The difference is that the startup one is used in the attractor in order to actually start the timers for the spider and the scorpion. Because if they're not there, then they won't show up. And it's because I have to kind of jumpstart the alarms in order to actually be able to check. Because the way it works is that when a spider dies, either by going out of the screen or being shot by the blaster, it'll start the timer again. And when the scorpion dies, it does the same thing, but the spider has two different ways of getting its alarm, setting an alarm. It's that if it goes out of the, I'll show it in Spider. If it goes out of the border, then it'll set the alarm to get the spider spawn time. That's for going outside of the border, and that's at a random time. But if it gets killed by the blaster in the game, it only spawns like around 3 or 4 seconds. So that's why I have two different times. One for when it goes out of the screen, one when it actually gets killed. The scorpion always is the same if it goes out of screen or it gets killed. And that's why I have to start up these things. Because if there's not a spider in the field, it'll never happen. And then for the other one, the load player wave, it does similarly the same thing, but it checks to see if there's already a scorpion in the field, in the scene. So if it's transitioning from one wave to the next, it'll keep that scorpion and it won't spawn another one, because that's the way it works in the game. Same thing for the scorpion and the spider. And each either the startup or the load wave creates the centipede based on the current wave. In the startup, it's going to be 0 because that's the first level. And then it creates any heads if there's any. It also checks to see if it has to spawn a flea. And that spawning flea, check to spawn flea. As you can see, it'll spawn a flea and set the scene as in fleas in scene if there's currently not one in the scene, and if the amount of mushrooms is below the threshold, and also if you can actually spawn a flea in this wave. So that's what that does. It's not operating on an actual alarm. And the centipede head is it's just literally creating it on the spot. Same for the create centipede. So the way you transition from one level to the other is if you destroy all the centipede segments. Now if I go to the centipede head segments, because the last one to be destroyed will be a head, If I look at the number of alive segments, if it's equal to 1, that means this is the last one to be killed. Then it'll get the player, current player. It'll increment the current wave. And then it'll stop spawning those centipede heads, because when it reaches the bottom, the centipede reaches the bottom, it'll start a trigger that just keeps spawning those heads on the left and right. So this stops that from happening. Because on the next wave, it won't. It only starts spawning when it gets at the bottom of the field. So if the wave manager loads a player wave, then it tells the wave manager to load the player wave, which is essentially the next level. So that's how transitioning works. And I'll show that transition. For the first one, I only have 1 centipede head, and then in the second level, I have 11, just to see the clear difference between the waves. Right now, I've disabled collisions. I have not. Sorry. I will destroy this head just to show that the next one will be 11. There you go. So there you go, 11 centipede length and then 1 head. And so that's how transitioning works. Player 2 mode transitioning is a little different, but I'll show that later on. I'm just showing that the wave manager actually does function. And that's how it transitions from one to the next. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what happens when the player dies. So the player should respawn on the same level. So if I start the game, I will show you that when I die, as you can see 1 centipede segment just for this demonstration, it'll bring me back to the same wave. But if I go to the next wave, so if I destroy, let me restart real fast. If I go to the next wave, I'll see that there's now 11 and 1 solo head. So if I kill myself, I should come back to the same level. And there you go. So the way this works is basically when the player dies, it will cause a player explosion to happen. Which I will show you, the player explosion. And at the end of the explosion, that's when the player will heal the mushrooms. So right here, when the player dies, it'll call a function in the wave manager called player died. So if I go to player died, basically what it does is it destroys all the entities in the field, because when the player dies, everything on the field should die, just like in the game. And destroy all entities is just destroying all the entities. So as you can see, if there's a spider unseen, delete. If there's a flea unseen, delete. It can't spawn mushrooms, can't spawn fleas, can't spawn spiders anymore. And reset the number of instances of the heads and recall all segments, which is just deleting every single centipede segment, and stop spawning those centipede heads. Okay, so basically then it calls healing all mushrooms on the current player's field. So if player 1, just player 1. So if I get the mushroom field fully heal, it'll fully heal all the mushrooms. I don't have a slow wipe right now. I couldn't implement it, but I do have it actually functioning. It just happens all at once. It does give 5 points for every 2 mushrooms. So, and then at the end, it'll call this end of wave decision, which happens only when the player dies. And when the player does die, if you look at end of wave decision, it calls upon the mode manager end of wave decision, which just gets the current mode's decision at the end. In this case, because it's the player 1, it just moves on. It just refreshes the load and subtracts 1 from the life. But if it was player 2, it would swap it out. But for now, I'll just show player 1, because I'm going to talk about mode switching later. So as you can see, if it still has lives, it'll spawn a new player, and it always loads the player wave. So that player wave is the same one that it died on. And then if it's game over, it'll clear the player field, destroy all wave entities, disable the spider spawning, and then check to see if there's a score. I did all the score stuff in the Wave Manager just because I didn't see there was a huge difference between putting it in its own thing. So, and you also said that the Wave Manager might take into account the current score, so that's why I did all the scoring in the Wave Manager. But for now, I'll just talk about the Wave Manager itself and do the mode switching and stuff later. So yeah, that's basically how it works. It just, if it's player one mode, which is just for the sake of this demonstration, it's always going to be like that for Wave Manager for this demonstration. Um, it'll just get the lives, clear the field. If it's dead, it'll always load the player wave, and that's how it works. So before diving into the game modes and like demo mode, game mode, and scoring, I'm going to talk about the HUD, the heads-up display, because I need to talk about the HUD before the actual game modes, because the game modes alter the HUD in different ways. So my heads-up display is a singleton because there's only one, and a global access is awesome. Basically, all my HUD is just a collection of list glyphs for each segment of the board, each segment of the heads-up display. So there's like player 1 score, which is the upper left, player 2 high score, which is in the middle of those. You have the player 1 lives remaining, the player 2 lives remaining, the credits, which says 2 credits in the beginning, the bonus credits, text saying high scores, the high scores list, the names of people associated with the high scores, and then the copyright at the bottom. These turn on and off depending on which mode you're on. So that's basically how it works. These are just the positions of where they're at, and then the strings. So the way it works is that on switching from mode to mode, it will change the status of the HUD, which I'll show later. But basically what the HUD does is, if I initialize it, so let's say we're on player 2 mode, it will clear all of the modes so far and then set everything to the initial placement. So the scores on the left and right should be 2 zeros, the middle should be the high score. So this is where this is. It sets the high score to the front of the list, which should be the highest score. And then it also does the same for the number of lives, which in this case depends on the player 1, which is the initial number of lives, which is going to be 2 on the left and then 3 on the right. So when attractor mode is activated, it actually shows the high scores, and the high scores is basically showing it is just literally writing out the high score. So it'll get the right here, this is the credits. It'll get the credits, which it says credits 2, and basically push that list onto there. And if there's not a mushroom on there already, it'll put a mushroom behind that text, and then it'll change that mushroom to be immune to damage and immune to poison. So that way, and set the texture sprite to a texture which I called mushroom transparency, which is just the same mushroom PNG, but without any actual color on it. It's just a transparent picture. And then you push that mushroom into the text mushrooms, which is a list, or I think it's a list or a queue. I mean a stack. It's a stack. It just holds the actual mushrooms. The reason I did that is because when you switch from the attractor mode to player 1 or player 2 mode, the list will go away, and you have to take into account removing those mushrooms behind the text too, so that the centipede can function normally. And I did the same for the bonus initial text, which says bonus every 12,000, and then this is the actual high scores. And the high scores, it basically just goes through the actual word high scores and implements it. But what's very important is writing the actual high scores and the actual names. So this basically just gets an iterator in the list, in the Wave Manager, which is get high scores lists, because in the Wave Manager, I did all of the scoring. So what I did is I got all of the information, all the waves, get high scores list. No, it's load high score list. Excuse me. Which does the same thing as the wave settings. It just gets the high scores from a high scores text and gets 2 column. It gets the current line score and the name, and then it pushes that combination into a high score combination, which is just a class that just holds 2 things: a string for a name and a integer for the score. And that's all it does. It just pushes that into a list where the front is going to be the uppermost score and the very last node in the list is going to be the lowest highest score. So basically, same with the loading wave information. It only calls loading high scores once. And then after that, it manipulates the high scores in the actual list so that it doesn't have to read it more than once. So again, for each item in there, you write a high score and you make mushrooms on it to account for the centipedes hitting it, and also for the I forgot to mention that if there's not a mushroom, it'll create a mushroom, but if there is a mushroom, it will just set that immune to damage, poison, and set the transparency as the texture. And then this section writes the names. Same reasoning, but just the names section of the actual line. So if you go to player 1 mode, I'll show this in action. This is the attractor mode. As you can see, it called show high scores, which just gets all these high scores and puts them there. As you can see, the centipede actually reacts to it because it's mushrooms. But the way that it's set up is, this is player 1. So as you can see, it has the score up there, which is the score in the high scores list. Which again, the first one is 14344, so that's correct. And again, if you look at the scores in the text file, they're all corresponding correctly. And player 2 mode is the initial mode. As you can see, it's 0, 0, 2 lives, and then the high score on top, and then 3 lives, and then the high score on the top right. And remove scores, all that does is basically clears all the attractor mode information, so the high scores and all the copyright stuff and all that. And it also removes all of the text mushrooms. And the way it changes score is that every time that, because the wave manages the score, every time you add to the player's current score, sorry, that's in player manager. Player manager, when you add to that player's score, player 1, if you add to that player's score, it'll actually add to the score, but it'll also set the player 1 score to that new score. So if you look here at set player 1 score, all it does is clears that list and then makes a new list with a new score. And it's the same thing for player 2 and the lives and everything like that. It just gets the number of lives and then clears it and then adds that blaster to the blaster images to the top right or top left, depending on which player, and then it just draws them. I also have other functions, which are to remove player 1 or player 2 lives, player 3 lives, because if you look at the mode manager, which I'll talk more about later, but if you look at the mode manager, when you go to set player to 1, you're not going to have the HUD displaying the player 2 lives or player 2 score. So what you do is you remove that player 2 score lives and display, which just clears that list. And whenever you transition to any of the game modes, you remove the high scores list, which is all the stuff in the attractor mode. But if you go in the attractor mode, then you show the list, which is first you initialize so that everything goes back to nothing. Then you show the high scores, and you remove the player 1 and player 2 lives display. So that's what gets you that. And then in player 1, you don't have any player 2 stuff. And in player 2, you have both. And that's pretty much it for the HUD. All it does is just displays everything accordingly. As I said before, whenever you add something to the player's score, it'll update that visual too. So as you can see on the top left, it keeps updating. Yeah, that's pretty much it for the adding to score. Another key thing to note is that when you add to the score, if it's greater than the highest score display number, then you basically set that high score, the HUD, the top middle, to that new score. So it dynamically changes the highest score, but it doesn't actually write. It only changes a dummy score, which is just an integer that is a place value holder for what the actual current score is. That's pretty much it for the HUD, I think. I got the HUD to work. I'm going to talk system. Basically, there's only one. And the singleton has many functions called like play blaster sound, play scorpion sound, stop spider sound, etc. And then it's actually a strategy pattern too, because the sound manager changes between silent mode and audible mode. And what that is basically you have one pointer of a sound system called sound sys, which is my current sound system, and then two other pointers, which is audible system and the silent system. And basically sound system is a base class which has all the same functions, so that when you actually in the sound manager, when you call a play spider sound, it calls the composed pointer, the composed sound system, to actually call its own play spider sound if you're doing spider sound in sound manager. And depending on which the sound system is pointing to, it'll either do the no sound system method, plays spider sound, or the audible system plays spider sound. In the audible system, you actually have all of the sounds, and here are the same methods. And so when you actually play that, as you can see in the constructor, these sounds are real. They have volume, loops for some of them not. Like the spider sound has a loop, centipede has a loop, and then set the volume. So if you're in the audible system in the sound manager, it'll actually play the blaster sound or the scorpion sound, and it'll stop all those sounds too if you play stop sound. But if you're using the no sound system, what it does is nothing. So it doesn't actually play the sound, so it gives the sense that there is actually a mute. And whenever you set one sound to the other, so for instance if you're set to audible or set to silent, it'll stop all the sounds before you actually do that. And that just basically allows you to change the sound manager on the fly. And one example of when I use this is in the mode manager, which we'll talk about soon. Whenever you go to first player mode or two player mode, your sound system will be audible. So I set to audible. Whenever you're in attractor mode, it will be in the silent mode. So it sets the silent mode. And I'll show that working. So in the attractor mode, there should be no sounds, as you can see. But as soon as you switch to any of the other sounds, there is sound. So there you go. And that's basically all for the sound system. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk about the game modes. And the game modes are kind of structured the same way that the sound system is, with a few additional other things. So if I go to the mode manager, you'll see that I have the mode manager, which is a singleton, because there's only one, and I wanted global access to it because it made sense to me getting into a manager. So basically you have a few functions. You have set mode to player 1 mode, set mode to player 2 mode, and set mode to attractor. And end wave decision, because depending on which mode you're in, the decision you make at the end when a player dies is dependent on the mode. So if you're like on player 1 mode, then you would just respawn the next wave, or the same wave. But if you're in 2-player mode, you actually have to swap the player and lower the correct player's lives too. Okay, so basically, as I said, it's kind of like the sound system where you have a mode, and that is the current mode, and then you have 3 other modes, because there's 3 types of modes. There's the attractor mode, 1-player mode, and 2-player mode. The current mode switches between attractor mode, 1-player mode, and 2-player mode. And that's where this comes into play, because if you look at the mode manager, the actual end of wave decision is dependent on that current mode. And if you look at the set mode to attractor, all it does is basically makes the state of the game be the state of what an attractor mode is defined as. So in the attractor mode, I allow the register of key inputtings, which is either key number 1 or number 2, to set the mode to player 1 or player 2, and excuse me. So when you press either number 1 or number 2, it'll get whatever that current mode's action is, and if you're in mode 2 or player mode 1, it won't actually do anything. But that's just in case. But because if you go to player 1 mode or player 2 mode, you actually deregister the input, so not allowing input from the mode manager, which is only supposed to take charge of if you press number 1, it'll go to player 1 mode, or if you go to player 2, it'll go to player 2 mode. But for instance, if we look at the set mode to attractor mode, which right off the start, at the startup, is going to be set mode to attractor mode, which is called in level 1 as soon as the game starts. So startup. And if when it goes to the attractor mode, basically what defines the attractor mode is, as you can see, I set the current mode to attractor mode, so that all the end wave decisions is what the attractor mode calls, which I'll describe in a bit, but for right now I'll do the states. The state is you basically initialize all the players to the initial start of the game. So every player, which is a base class, I have a player manager, also a singleton. It just basically holds the current player, player 1, player 2, and player 0. Player 0 is the attractor player. So as you can see, it has a spawn new player at the current score. So whenever you actually add score, you're adding it to the current player's score. And if you're in player 2 mode, that end of wave decision in the mode manager swaps that player. So in the mode manager, going back to the mode manager, you initialize those players' values to the lives being 3, the score being 0, etc. And then you destroy the blaster and the blaster bullet and player explosion if there's anything. That way, so that the blaster doesn't leak into the other mode, if there is one. The bullet does not leak into the other one if there is one. And then you destroy all the wave entities, because this is all cleaning up the previous mode. And now, because it's a detractor mode, you change the player to player 0, which is the detractor mode, and you also set the silent mode as a sound system. And then, because you want to start the player, you lower the lives by 1, and you spawn a new player. That's the first player in the first start of the mode. And then you initialize the HUD, which basically has everything: player 1 lives, player 2 lives. But because you don't actually want the lives showing, you can remove them, and that's what gives you that look of the attractor mode. And also, you have to start the player field. So when you switch this mode, because it's player 0, it's going to be the tractor mode's mushroom field. And because it's a tractor mode, you also want to show the high scores. And the Wave Manager startup is what I talked about before, where we need the spiders and the scorpions to actually start their timers so that they can spawn into the further levels, and that's what that does. And then player 1 mode is similar, except it cleans up the attractor mode things, and also makes sure objects don't leak into the other one. And then here it removes that high scores list from the attractor mode, and gets rid of those fake mushrooms too. And then it clears the previous mushrooms, so the attractor mushrooms field, and destroys all the wave entities, which is from the previous field. And also, because when you start off in either player 1 or player 2, you always start off as player 1. So I set the mode to player 1 mode, and I also changed the player to player 1. And I initialized player 1, because that's the only player that actually matters at this point. I increased the audible, and etc, etc, etc. Same thing for set mode to 2-player mode, but it allows both scores to be active and everything. So the next major thing is the end of wave decision. As I talked about, there's different modes it's composed. So here are the modes. This is the base class, which just has end of wave decision and those action 1 for number 1 and number 2, and also press enter and high score action. And that changes the high score input, which I'll talk about later. But in player 1 mode, the end of wave decision is basically just check to see if the player 1 has lives, and then spawn a new player if the game is over, or if all of the lives are up for the first player. Then you clear the field, you destroy all the wave entities, disable the spider spawning, and then you update player lives, because if it's 0, it's going to be 0. And at this point, this is when you check to see if the player has a high score. And my high score input is actually a singleton. High score input. So it's a singleton, as you can see, and basically it has the when a player is completely dead, it'll start up the high score input, which basically just when you start up, it basically makes the number of letters entered so far 0. It initializes the actual input, and then it sets the notification text, like it says, oh, new score, etc. And then it also allows the input, so it registers the input, and that way whenever you put in letters, it'll add the letters to the list containing all the glyphs, so you can actually see it. It also does have functionality to backspace. And once you press enter, which is Unicode 13, it'll call the wave manager to check for a new high score with whatever the player inputted, and then writes that to the file. So once that's done, it'll get that mode manager and it'll do the actions for whatever mode you're in. In player 1, the mode would just be to go to attractor mode. In mode manager 2, it would be to swap players, because you still have that that player 2 having a life at the end of player 1's game over. And then you stop the input. So basically, whenever it's called, it'll get those 3 integers. I mean, it'll get up to 3 letters, and you press enter, and that's it. And that's how high score works. But as you can see, player 1, once it's dead, just set the mode to attract and it'll go back. In mode 2, so player 2 mode, it's very different, because if the player's lives is equal to 0, then that's when it's game over. And then you check to see if there's a new high score. And that basically says if this player's has beaten one of the high scores, then you start input from that high score. As I said before, you initiate the high score input, and then you get the input, and once that's done, as you can see, that press enter high score input, it'll if both players are dead, it'll set the mode to attractor, else it'll swap players, load that player's wave, and just start that wave. So unless both players are dead, it won't go to attractor mode, and that's how I did the swapping of modes, and that is pretty much it, I think. I've gotten the 1 or 2 players, 3 lives each, games proceeding in waves, players alternate, each on its own wave, which I've shown in the wave managers. On death, high score reached player asked to enter 3 initials, and I will show that right now. Then we had to do the scoring points implemented as specified on the info page of the game. I already described how the HUD displays scores lives, and it does do it correctly. So right now I'll just destroy the object. So mushroom was 1 point, and then the spider I've already shown actually depends on how far away. As you can see, the thing changes. So each entity has its own own score, just so that it's accordance to the field. When you die, every 2 mushroom gives you 5 points. So I think there's 5 mushrooms damage, so I should get 10 points. There you go. And just to show that the high score input works, I will change all these to very low values. And then start the game and show that it does work. And I'll do it for 2 players just to show that both players work. So as you can see, there's 3. That should be a score. This is player 2. So I'll have 900. Now I'll just keep killing myself. So this is going to be the end of player 1. As you can see, it says new high score. Please enter initials, and I'll say fun. And then this is the last player for player 2. And if I destroy myself, again I got a new score, and I'll call it get. So now if you look at the attractor mode, fun has been added, and then get has been added too as the top score. And as you can see on the top, the actual high score is changed as well. And as you saw before, it also changes dynamically when it beats the higher score, which I'll show again. Yeah, and that's basically it for the scores.